Okay, today we want to talk about the establishment of order. We have talked about city people, about the way life changes in the 19th century in large urban centers. But the city itself changes in other official ways. City government begins to change. So that if we had to just generalize, we would say that in the 19th century, many responsibilities that we now associate with cities are assumed by cities. Most of the responsibilities of states don't really come until the 20th century. I'm going to talk just about a few things. Fire, we've already said a few words about it, but things like water, police, public health, open space. If we had more time, we could go on to talk about sanitation, public education, issues that become critical in the 19th century that people were not thinking about almost at all in the 18th century, and that many places in the world don't have to deal with until the 20th century. But in big cities, and especially in places like London and New York and Boston, more than in other world cities, both because usually they weren't big, or they weren't that rich, or they just weren't dealing with the issue. And so it has a significance. Now, I would like to propose three impossible interpretations of all of these. You might have other interpretations, and you need not accept any of these, but let me just run through three ways to look at it, or ask your students to look at it. One would be kind of a liberal or progressive or positive interpretation, which is to say that as we come together in in cities, that problems are created because of the concentration of people, and we think of ways to solve the problem. In other words, cities solve the problems that cities create. And to remind you, we all live in territorial governments in the United States. We all live within the boundaries of a state or a county, so that no matter what crime you commit against somebody else, it's a county offense. But other kinds of laws that you might break that have to do with things like spitting or parking illegally or speeding or running red lights are results of corporate forms of government. In other words, a group of people come together, receive an incorporation or charter from the state that allows the city to do certain things that the rest of the state cannot do. A recent example in New York that you may have heard of is congestion pricing. The city wanted to have the right to charge cars that were moving south of 96th Street an immediate charge of $8. In other words, as soon as they would have these monitors, and the second your car broke the plane, you automatically were charged $8. That's what they do in London as we speak. If you break into areas in central London, you were charged really about $15 now. It's had a dramatic impact on central London. But that's something that the state, and it was killed in the state legislature, even though it was a city thing, because the state has to give the city the right to do this. And so city legislators killed it in the state legislature because some city legislators representing the outer boroughs, the people who drive a lot of cars, were against it. The people who were wealthier, who lived in Manhattan or the suburbs, were for it. Another issue of a class breakup here. Anyway, you understand what I'm saying is this. Now these city things, so we're going to talk about the city's response. The response of people in tight circumstances to situations that had not been critical before cities grew rapidly in the 19th century. And New York, being exceptionally fast growing, exceptionally rich, and in the United States, tended to face these problems fairly early. So let's think about something. Now, we talked about fire, and we just need to reiterate that fire was the most dangerous of problems in early cities because houses were up against each other. And if a place caught fire, let's think in the 17th century, the 16th century, the 18th century, If that happened, disaster could result because the entire city could go up in flames. What happens over time is that the cities think of ways to deal with this. Volunteer fire companies are organized. Benjamin Franklin organizes the first in Philadelphia in the 1740s. But that's a group of organized people who are not paid except as terms of rewards, who will undertake to help put out the fires. And they have a fraternal, a political, and ethnic dimension. And over time, they become more and more important until in a few cities, like New York and Boston and London and a few other places, they become professionalized in the middle and late 19th century. A process that's fought by the volunteer firemen, but that the mercantile business interests want because they want to protect. They want to protect their assets downtown. Anyway, that's one interpretation, would be progressive, liberal, optimistic. Another interpretation, just broadly of all these issues, is Marxist. And that would argue, we have fire departments, but we frankly don't care whether you fry or not. I mean, we'll help you, we'll try to save you if you're in the window here. But the reason we have a fire department is to protect the assets of the rich. Or the reason we have a police department, we know we don't really want you to be raped or somebody steal your purse. But that's not why, don't kid yourself, that's why we have a police department. The police department is to protect the established order. And that's what it's about. And even public health. We would rather nobody die of dread diseases. But the reason we're going to invest in it is not because we care about you as an individual, because we surely don't. But we want to keep the factories whirling and the workforce healthy so they can produce for us. And that's a Marxist interpretation. Yeah, I believe more or less in the first one. I'm an optimist. And then the third interpretation, which is sort of gaining currency here in the 21st century and later, is kind of an environmental interpretation, which doesn't even believe either the optimistic or the Marxist, but says the cities don't really solve the problems, they just move them somewhere else. And we'll come to water. Los Angeles solves this water problem by taking it from someplace else. So is the problem solved? New York solves its sewage problem by dumping it in the river. So now we don't have sewage backed up in 97 Orchard Street, but we just gave the problem to somebody else. And so the environmental thing is we should all have a lighter carbon footprint. And that in fact, most of these so-called solutions, if we look at them very carefully and analytically, aren't solutions at all. They're temporary solutions that usually contain the seeds of their own destruction. So let's just run through a few of these other issues. And let's look at water. Now, was it the rhyme of the ancient mariner Samuel Coleridge who says, water, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink? Well, think about it. You know, as you head into outer space, and some of you may someday, my chances are past, but as you look back at the Earth, what color is it? It's blue, because most of the Earth's surface, about 70%, is water. So 70% of the surface of the Earth is water. And so there's obviously a lot of water around, but this is the problem. 97+ percentage of all that water is salty. And that means you can't drink it. You can't use it for most purposes. So that leaves 2.7%, give or take, of all the world's water that human beings can use. The problem is that 3/4 of that is locked in underground aquifers and especially in polar ice and icebergs. What we can use as human beings is a good bit less than 1% of all the water that nature has, or God has provided for us. So, and by the way, of that 1%, 20% is in one lake in Russia, in Siberia, called Lake Baikal. And Lake Baikal is, yeah, it's kind of big. It looks like something of the Great Lakes, but it's got the water in it, not because it's physically so huge, but because it's so deep. It's really, really deep. So some huge amount of the Earth's water is there in Siberia in this one lake where Russian couples get married, and it's a major place in well, I was going to say Soviet Union, I mean Russia. Well, so what? Why are we concerning ourselves with these details? Well, because of all the things that sustain us as living organisms, water is numero uno. Without water, you know, I should go on a threatening starvation diet for some cause and keep it going for about a month and lose 30 pounds. And you can do that, you know, depending on how fat you are, you can go a long time without eating. But how long are you going to last if you don't take some water? You know, 3, 4 days, 5, something like this. You will die. First you'll lose your mind, and then you will soon after that die. And it doesn't matter who you are, whether you're a football player, whether you're a baby or something else. You must have water or you will die, and you have to have a lot of water. So this is not a forgettable thing. Without water, cities cannot exist. In fact, if you look at a world map of where cities are located, you notice that they're not distributed evenly across the globe. They're concentrated. And usually they're concentrated on the oceans, but often especially concentrated on where there's some water that you can tap. And people have known this forever. Without water, no people. In fact, Philip II of Spain, some of you have heard of him, he even said in his Laws of the Indies in 1573, when he was telling his conquistadors and his explorers, how do you decide where to put a settlement representing the King of Spain? Well, look for water. You got to look for some fuel too, but if there's no water there, save yourself a lot of energy and don't even start. Because if you can't find water, you're not going to survive. Anyway, so where do we get water? Where is water? Well, it's interesting about cities. I don't know if anybody's been to Ephesus in Turkey, where I think Paul's letter to the Ephesians was written, and where I think Cleopatra visited one time. But now it's in Turkey somewhere, but apparently it used to be on the water. It no longer is on the water. It's miles from the water. So water moves around a bit. But other places have dealt with water in the past. For example, if you've been to Europe, you've often seen these huge Roman aqueduct systems. The Romans were masters at moving water around and doing it elegantly. And you can still see 2,000 years later some of these Roman aqueducts around in Europe. In New York, the old Pennsylvania Station, which was roughly 33rd Street and 8th Avenue, was modeled after the baths of Caracalla in Rome, you know, a huge, wonderful bathhouse. And the Romans had bathhouses where you could go and clean up, and they were cool, and there was plenty of water. Similarly, there were systems in other great cities, but there was a decline in water systems between roughly 400 and 1900, when water systems around the world declined in quality, certainly through the Middle Ages. London, for example, in 1800 had 8 private water systems, each lousier than the other one, you know, all taking water mostly out of the contaminated Thames River. In the United States, let's think about where we get water. Well, the simple answer is we turn on the faucet, but that's actually not the answer, as you well know. But think about where water comes from. Well, it comes from rivers sometimes. And there are cities in the United States and places that take their water from nearby waterways. The most prominent examples I can think about at the moment would be Philadelphia, which takes it out of the Schuylkill River, or New Orleans, which takes its water out of the Mississippi River. By the way, that may be one of the reasons New Orleans is such a dangerous, unhealthy city, because by the time the Mississippi River gets to New Orleans, it has the sewage of Chicago and St. Louis and Memphis, just to name 3 quick ones, in it. So it takes a lot of purification to make that water possible to drink, and we haven't always done it, so New Orleans has typically had the highest death rates and been one of the unhealthiest cities. I should say that nature, you know, if you're religious, you've got to admit this is impressive. Nature doesn't make mistakes about water. Water purifies itself. You can't pollute water in nature. Whatever you do to it, as it runs through the ground or as it runs through time and water, it purifies itself. The problem of cities, just to get to it, is that you can overwhelm the, you know, you got to have so much ground and so much water, or the river's got to travel so fast, so far, and then it will purify it. What we have done in cities is to overwhelm the ability of nature to deal with it. You could see what would happen in Lower Manhattan, where you've been. There's suddenly too many people in a small area and not enough dirt, so that the actions of nature cannot purify that water as it goes to the ground. It could if it were in the middle of Nebraska. It could have if it were somewhere else. Similarly with the Mississippi River. You know, you could pee in the Loxa River in Idaho. That river will clean itself up pretty soon. You're not going to kill any wildlife in the Loxa River by peeing in it, because it's moving fast and presumably not that many people are doing it. But if you get a lot of people doing it, then you overwhelm the ability of the Loxa River to purify itself over a given amount of space. So I think that is background to what's happening here, and that's where the environmental or ecological interpretation is coming from. So rivers would be one. Lakes would be another. We were in 5 Points, and we mentioned that there was a freshwater pond or collect where at 5 Points, that slum, and that was a freshwater lake. That's why it was called that. And that was wonderful. Here you have fresh water right here by the city. But then the problem is people start polluting it as they live around it. And therefore it becomes less palatable and they do other things with it and it no longer exists. But think about Chicago and where Chicago gets its water, from Lake Michigan. When we say the Great Lakes are so impressive, freshwater lakes, those lakes are not salty. They are freshwater lakes. I want to say they're the largest freshwater lakes in the world. And Chicago takes its water out of Lake Michigan. They're huge filtration plants to, you know, just things that nature didn't quite clean up, but nevertheless, that's where it gets it. Another way to get water is wells. Below the water, below the Sahara Desert, below everybody, there's water. But the problem is, you don't want to go that deep in the Sahara Desert. In New Orleans, the water table is about how far from the ground? Probably about this far. You know, you don't see any basements in New Orleans. In fact, in many parts of New Orleans, you don't see any cemeteries, at least in not normal cemeteries. People are buried on top of the ground, because if you buried them in a normal way, there would be water down there. And of course, you know what Katrina did to the cemeteries in New Orleans as the place floods. But theoretically, there are wells everywhere. And on a farm or many other places, you can drill a well and dig a well, whatever you get it, and water will come up, and just depends on the water table. Because somewhere, everywhere, if this is the ground, somewhere down here there's a water table. In the Sahara Desert, it's way down here. In New Orleans, it's way up here. But somewhere down there, there's water, if you just want to go get it. So that's a possible thing. And then occasionally there are springs or artesian wells. In Memphis, Tennessee, we had water literally bubbles up. I mean, that really makes it easy to get. And then there are some places, there are glaciers that you could float if you really wanted water, but you really need to be a Saudi prince to afford that, because you got to cut it up somewhere and float it a long way, and you probably lose 50% or more in the floating. It takes a pretty big tugboat to get it there. And then there are cisterns. If you've ever been to Bermuda, you know that Bermuda is a coral reef. So that means there is no real dirt. At least there's no far down dirt, so there's no water table under it. So the only place, and there are other places in the world where they get there, a cistern means that essentially you're trapping rainwater. I think they do that in a lot of New Zealand too, by the way. And that means that all those drains off the ceiling rather than just going into the ground, they feed into holding tanks that you have, and you recycle that to run it through your toilets or anything else to make it work. Anyway, and then you can use desalinization. You can take salt water and drink it. But the problem, and we do it at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, and a few Saudi princes, in fact, do that. The thing is, you burn so much energy in making salt water possible to drink, I guess by boiling it and lots of other stuff, and then that it's not practical. There is no practical way to turn, as of this moment, there's no way to increase the amount of water we've got by desalinization. It's just too expensive. Sounds like it ought to work, but in fact it doesn't really work. So I don't want to talk about it a whole lot, except to say that in the course of the 19th century, the water problem comes to be solved. Solved in that first interpretation, that liberal interpretation. It's solved in New York's case because New York is in some ways a rainforest. Not a full rainforest, but if nobody does anything, and the books have been written about this, they would be trees 100 feet tall where we sit. In other words, in a century or so, that's what will be here. Nobody has to water it, God waters it. And so it's a natural rainforest. And so, in that sense, what New York did, but why can't New York go into, so what's New York's problem? It rains plenty here. We could go to cisterns. Originally they went to wells. But the problem with the wells was that we polluted the wells because too many people lived in a small area, so the wells got polluted. It's even said that the cocktail drink Manhattan derives its name from the color of the water that they were getting out of the wells, and people knew they couldn't give it away, so they sold it as medicine. I mean, you know, some of these stories you don't know. But the wells, the water table falls, it gets polluted, so the city does. Why can't it go to the Hudson River or the East River, because it's brackish here. In other words, the Hudson River is the river that flows both ways. Depending on the tides, all the way up to Poughkeepsie, it's salty going back and forth. And so you cannot take water out of the Hudson River and drink it. So the city had to think of something. The city in this sense was lucky. In this sense, the historical and geographical accident is terrific because the city was first forced to confront what Philadelphia or New Orleans were not forced to confront. New York couldn't get its water from rivers, whereas they could. So in the 1830s, New York had to think of something else. And what it thought of is go somewhere else and get the water and pipe it in. And without making a long story short, beginning in the 1840s, 1842, when the Croton Aqueduct is finished, New York brings mountain water into the city. It expands the Croton Aqueduct system throughout the Gilded Age. But the Croton Aqueduct system is incredibly important in the history of the city. And I say this for a variety of reasons. One thing is the average New Yorker uses more in our time, more than 300 gallons of water per person per day. Now you just said, I didn't get my 300 gallons yesterday. But that is because people use water for a variety of sources, a variety of reasons. But New Yorkers are especially profligate because for another historical reason, because water was so plentiful, they decided not to put water meters. So that unlike California, where there are all monitors about water and flushing, in New York you could go back and turn on your water fountain in almost all apartment buildings and run it from now till this time next year, and it won't cost you another nickel because they don't have meters. Now, that's one thing to remember. And by the way, Consumer Reports did about 25 years ago, so it probably hadn't changed too much, did a blind tasting of water, you know, with Perrier and all these bottled waters. And in terms of both quality and taste, New York City tap water came out #1. Because it's mountain water, they just pop bottling in a different place. Now there are some few problems with it introduced by just the transportation system and these old pipes coming in. But basically, it's a terrific water system. But it also points to another issue in the United States, which again is history. We made decisions in the 19th century, and these decisions were generally followed in the Gilded Age and other cities, to have what we call a unified water system. That means that at the end, that means that after lunch, go back to your apartment or your dorm room and put your glass in the commode and you can drink it. Yeah, I'm not going to do that personally. But you know what? That's the same water. That water is drinkable. Now, no place else in the world does that. But in the United States, generally, we have one system. You know, if you go to Paris or you go to another country, you do not turn on the tap in your bathroom unless somebody said that water is drinkable. Because most countries have one system for sewage and toilets, another system for washing, and another much smaller system for drinking. But we thought we were so rich that we could just have one system, and generally that's the way it is. In the 21st, but just as we're learning now about the limits of oil, soon enough we may learn about the limits of water. And in the 21st century, assuming we get the energy crisis solved, which is assuming a lot, water is already much more expensive than oil. I mean, think of what a bottle of water costs you. You could get gasoline a heck of a lot cheaper than that. And think of what is going to happen in the 20th century if the population of the world continues to grow, because the people of Africa, most African countries, don't even use a gallon of water per person per day. And we just said New York is over 300 gallons per person per day. Anyway, we could talk about Los Angeles, which does exactly the same as New York, which goes to the Owens Valley and takes it in. The problem with LA is that it's essentially an arid climate. And so by taking it from the Owens Valley, they turned the Owens Valley into a desert. And so the entire Southwest does not have enough water. And so they're all trying to get from the same few sources. And the problem is the water table. We got Tucson here, we got other places. The problem is the water table is going down. More people are trying to use the water. They're trying to get rid of the front yard, not for reasons of what I'm saying, but the reasons we don't have enough water to water the grass. So let's put rocks or something else that doesn't need as much water there. But it's a huge issue, and it continues today, and it's going to continue through the lifetime of your students. Probably is an even bigger issue. In the interest of time, let me just run through some of these other establishments, and what could be more indicative of the establishment of order than the police. You know, there has to, in all human societies, there has to be some way to police the system. After all, the word police comes from the word polis, which is city. But for a long time it worked to have informal methods of social control. Think of the scarlet letter. You know, if we put a big A on your dress or your chest, the shame of it is enough to kind of keep people in line. Or just think of the very idea of the stocks and how you're supposed to be embarrassed. And I guess that worked well enough for a long time. But what happens when cities begin to have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 people? Imagine today, you can just look around you in New York City, you can see people are not embarrassed by all sorts of things that you think they ought to be embarrassed about. Think of how the boys wear their pants, so that not only does it seem their whole rear end is out, but most of their underwear is sticking out. You would want to think they'd be embarrassed about this, but they're not. So you can see how values change, and people who want to change behavior have to begin to think of ways to make this happen. Anyway, let's think of the 19th century and why we begin to get police. Before that, you had the watch. And what were the watch looking for? Mostly the watch was looking for fires, because that's what they were worried about, and the occasional drunk. But there was no reason to be out at 1 o'clock in the morning. Why would anybody want to be out at 1? The idea of an after-hours club, a late-night bar, you know, they didn't have much of that. And even if you went to a brothel, of which there was some, the idea was that business could be finished well before midnight. So people were home doing nothing much but sleeping at night. Over a period of time, and certainly by the early 19th century, this system began to break down. And let's think of 3 reasons why it didn't work. One of the reasons is riots. Now, we talked about volunteer firemen. Volunteer fire companies on the way to the fire. Or think about the movie Gangs of New York, where you saw the big gangs and you ask yourself, where are the police? People are going outside with knives and clubs and doing all these terrible things. Where are the cops? Well, the cops were nowhere to be had because there really was not yet a fully developed police department in what we would think the modern sense of the word is. And I'm not going to mention all the riots, but riots are getting big in the 1830s. Part of them about abolitionists. You know, if an abolitionist comes to town, a nutcase like William Lloyd Garrison, who thinks that we should get rid of slavery and take people's property away from them, you could be sure that you were going to have a riot if somebody like that spoke. I mean, those are incendiary words. And I could quote you things about New York City in the 1860s or 1850s, when people who didn't care about whether slavery existed or not, but still didn't want to see abolitionists because they did business with the South. Anyway, riots would be one issue because the police could not stop the fire companies from fighting each other. In other words, their force was not greater than that of the rowdies on the street. A second problem, and we could talk about all these riots and stuff like this, felonious criminality, you know, serious crimes. We don't know whether murder, I mean, a friend of mine, Eric Monken, wrote a book on murder in New York City, but it's very hard to know about murder, and you're not always certain about the incidence of murder, a time when records weren't very good. So maybe murder happened a lot in the 17th century, but the ability of a person to deal with felonious criminality got less as the city got bigger. Because one of the things was that before you had a police department, you didn't have a system by which it was anybody's business to recover your, let's say that somebody at lunch steals your purse and runs away with it. And this is 150, or let's call it 180 years ago. There's nobody whose business it is to recover that purse. Or somebody knocks in your glass window and steals something. The only way you can do it is if you find the perpetrator. There are constables, and you could say, he did that to me, this big guy in the black shirt. He did it. I'm charging him. You could go drag Joel as a constable and say, I need to have him arrested. And he would probably do it. You know what I mean? Then we'd have a little trial. But it wasn't Joel's responsibility to go out and worry about my problem. Let me tell you just a quick story that happened to me. When I was living in Chicago and going to the University of Chicago, and my wife was a public school teacher in a tough town called Harvey. One day in the summertime, probably the summer of '64, I cannot remember when it was, but let's call it, could have been '65, maybe '65. I remember being sunburned. I guess I was not studying that hard because we must have been at a beach and I have light skin. And so I remember being scorching hot and a sunburn. And being in bed, and Chicago is an alley city. New York is not an alley city. One could do interesting studies of comparing cities according to whether they're alley cities or not, but Chicago's an alley city. And at about 2 o'clock in the morning, or some hour in the middle of the night when I was completely asleep, all of a sudden my wife, who was sleeping, said, just lets out this blood-curdling curse. And I can't repeat it in this particular audience. But, you know, I stand up, you know, has my wife gone mad? You know, what in the world is going on? And she tells me that she's just seen 2 guys smash the windshield on my car. Happened to be an English Ford. You know, I was a graduate student. You know, a windshield cost $100 then, which was a heck of a lot of money. And with more anger than brains, and remind me about how I did this yesterday. I thought on your behalf, but it was stupid, and I'll tell you later. But, you know, I was just suddenly furious. I remember throwing on a pair of shorts and putting on cigarettes and running down the alley. And I thought that in a little house on the alley, 100 yards down, I heard noises. And I remember banging on the door. What did I know? But I heard noises and said, did somebody just run in this place? And I think it was a female voice said something like, no. Anyway, I don't know what happened then. The next day I called the police. And the police are very interested because they said, you know, it's interesting. Last night we had a rape charge on that alley. And we're very interested in this case. And so And then I remember going back home. So my memory is, but I do remember that very soon after that, maybe the next day, 2 guys come to my door and say, "We were drunk last night. We are very sorry. We're happy to pay for your windshield. You know, $150, whatever it is, you know." And so they made me whole. And somehow this must have been communicated to the police, because I got my money back, my windshield's fixed, I'm out of here. And I remember they sent a police car for me to bring me in to talk to this judge. And he said, "We're pleased that you got your windshield back, but it's not between you and the guy who hit your windshield. This is between the state of Illinois and those guys. In the state of Illinois, this happens, and we don't often catch them. So they have committed a crime against the state of Illinois. It happened to be you, but it's the state of Illinois versus them. And if you don't testify, I will subpoena you." You know what I mean? Anyway, it was a lesson of the transformation of law in the 19th century. That's now it's no longer about you, and this is about the rise of the police. Because, so I'm going to try to make a long story. By the way, the third category here, that's felonious criminality, was the second. And the third is individual moral transgression. Different kind of thing. You gamble, you drink, you go to prostitutes. Those are sins. We ought not to allow that in a civilized society. Now, people had believed that for centuries. But once you get a police force, now the ideal can become the real. Now, because we know we had brothels and everything in New York and in seaport towns in the 18th century. Of course you did. But now we can actually stop this. We can stop it. We have, so what you begin to have, and we won't remember the exact date, starts before the Civil War. By the Gilded Age, it's in full force. Uniform police, uniforms, rules, ranks, buttons, all sorts of stuff, organized into different precincts and with new responsibilities. And the attitude toward crime changes. In other words, if you were to go to Yankee Stadium and they're playing the Red Sox and it's close, the police will be there in anticipation of problems. If Fidel Castro decides he's going to visit the United Nations tomorrow, which he has an absolute right to do, or anybody else who is controversial is coming to New York, you can be sure that there will be demonstrations. So the police will anticipate that problem. But see, that's a whole new way of looking at the police. Anyway, it's a change in, it's the part of the establishment of order. Some would say it's gone too far in New York City today. Order is in control in New York now. And it had been moving that way for since at least the Gilded Age. So that whereas the image of the city being out of control, that's not the case. The city is, that doesn't mean you can't buy whatever you can afford, but it means it's got to be very, very careful about it. I'm going to just end by saying that there is a difference also in history about the way in which we deal with police in the United States. Here, who is the stereotypical cop in a place like New York and Boston? Irish cop. The Irish cop grows out of the neighborhood. You might have to push those buttons. I think that light's about to go out. But yeah, I'm not sure what's going to happen. But in any case, in England or in many other countries, what will happen is that the police are national police and are controlled by the national government. In London, in the last part of the 19th century, the police were typically recruited from the countryside, were brought into the city to live in barracks on the theory, and were not expected so much to be citizens as to control the citizens, and not to be friends with the people who they were monitoring. That doesn't seem like a good idea. If I like you, maybe I'm going to be a little slippery in my enforcement of the law. The American model, or the difference between New York and London is, in New York, first of all, they carried guns, You noticed in London they didn't. And the police for a long time, by the way, don't want to have uniforms. Because if you have a uniform, let's suppose somebody, which unfortunately is in America not impossible to imagine, somebody starts shooting people in another classroom here. Most of us are going to get under the table to climb out the window, whatever. But if somebody is sitting here with a police uniform on, we expect that person to head for the problem, not run away from it. Well, they thought the same thing. It may be a problem they don't want to head for, and so wearing a uniform sort of puts expectations on you. But anyway, the uniforms, the arming, but where is the person supposed to live? Is he supposed to be a citizen or not? Yes. We want him to be a citizen. We would prefer that he be married with children, and we not only want him to live in the city, we often, and sometimes require him to live in the ward which he patrolled. In fact, there are rules all over the United States today that if you want to be a policeman in Tulsa, you have to live in Tulsa, not live somewhere else. We want you here. You know, don't protect somebody else, protect us. That's a different way of looking at the whole entire issue. Let's go through public health. What is the difference in public health? Well, we get sick and we die. I mean, there is a sense that what the heck has that got to do with government? All of us are going to die. Some of us are luckier than others. But there's an important change that happens in the 19th century, and New York is part of it, and that is to begin to think of your health as public health, especially if it's contagious. That it's not just your issue, it's all of our issues. And I would like to speak about a disease called cholera, C-H-O-L-E-R-A, which mercifully is not a disease that most of you spend time worrying about. But cholera is still a disease in the world. It's still very common in South Asia. It would be India and places like that. Anyway, it comes to the United States in 1832 and hangs on until 1833, actually. Then in 1848, 49, and then in 1866. In point of numbers, many fewer people died of cholera than of malaria, tuberculosis, and lots of other things. But it was, in some ways, a classic epidemic disease of the 19th century. It was a crisis demanding a response, because when it hit very hard. And it's, in some ways, it's similar to some issues today. You know, cancer doesn't kill nearly as many people as heart disease. But, you know, cancer, some other issues, or we won't talk about them, but we don't always focus on the disease that kills the most people. Anyway, it was the classic disease, epidemic disease of the 19th century, like the plague had been in the 14th century. By that time, yellow fever had disappeared in the north. By the way, not in the south. My hometown of Memphis was devastated by yellow fever epidemics in 1872, 1878, Gilded Age, that changed the city forever. In the 1870s, early 1870s, Memphis was a kind of a diverse city. Germans, Irish, stuff like this. The epidemic of yellow fever comes. The Germans flee and they go to Cincinnati and St. Louis because they have money. The Irish stay and they die. The wasps escape to the countryside and mostly live. The blacks stay in the city, but for whatever reason they seem to have a gene that made them not die of yellow fever. So Memphis goes from being a diverse city to being a black-white city. Really a glorified Mississippi town throughout the 20th century. Some could say even up to, and you know, but it changes the course of, it changes the trajectory of a city's history. Now, we're not going to talk about Memphis, but these aren't, epidemic diseases are not minor. Anyway, cholera flourished in great cities. It begins in the Far East, particularly India. It flourished where there was filth and poverty. It only there was a growth in trade, so that's something else that we notice in history is the oceans begin to fill up with sailboats as trade is going, and New York is a big center. It only occupied the world stage for a little while. And by the way, it's not until the 1880s when Robert Koch, almost the same name as the guy who, same spelling exactly, as the guy who gave the $100 million yesterday. directing a German scientific expedition in Egypt, finally isolated what caused cholera, which is a bacterium. Anyway, once it finds its way into your intestines, it produces an acute disease, and mostly if you have cholera, you either die in like 72 hours or you survive. I mean, it's just like, there's nothing we could do about it. And you know, doctors, not to say anything against the medical profession, but 130 or 40 years ago, they didn't necessarily help. I mean, you know, whether they bled you with leeches or gave you an enema with tobacco smoke or other similarly weird things, they weren't really helping the situation a whole lot. Anyway, we know now it's unwashed hands, uncooked fruit, vegetables, especially polluted water that causes this. Anyway, what I want to talk about is, I don't want to talk about the disease, but I want to talk about who got it. And that is, well, it happened in all cities, but it happened to the Irish in 5 points. We were in 5 points. That's where it really hit, was in 5 points. And why does it hit 5 points? Well, let me just read what the Evening Post had about 5 points. The 5 points are inherited by a race of beings of all colors, ages, sexes, and nations. That generally of but one condition, and that almost of the vilest brute, with such a crew, and happening the most populous and central portion of the city. When may we be considered secure from pestilence? Be the air pure from heaven, their breath would contaminate it and infect it with disease. The Irish got cholera because they were disgusting, because they were drunk, because they were poor, because they were uneducated. They brought it on themselves. That was what people thought. By the way, the comparison with AIDS in the end of the 20th century is very, very close. So let me read you a couple of things that people said. John Pintard said, those attacked were chiefly of the very scum of the city. And the sooner this group was dispatched, the sooner the disease would run its course. And some of you may remember also during AIDS when people said, look, if these people were living moral lives, if they were following the laws of civilization, they wouldn't be getting AIDS. And therefore, it's God's condemnation of them. That's more or less what people thought about cholera at the same time. It's a judgment on the way you live. We have lots and lots of quotations. In fact, let me just say, if somebody is particularly interested in cholera, let me suggest 2 sources. One is, there's an exhibition at this moment at the New York Historical Society on cholera that kind of talks about these same points. And if you want a book on it, it's a book by Charles Rosenberg called The Cholera Years, which is about these 3 epidemics. He's now more famous for yet another reason. Charles Rosenberg graduated from Columbia, got his PhD right here in this building, taught for many, many years at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, got divorced from his first wife and married a graduate student. Her name is Drew Gilpin Faust. She's now the president of Harvard University. So he's better known now as the wife of the president, the husband of the president of Harvard. But the book, The Cholera Years, is an interesting book because of what he said. Again, the attitude of the rich about the Irish, they knew the Irish chiefly as servants and stuff like this. What happens in New York is in 1866, and then following through the Gilded Age, the city creates something called the Metropolitan Board of Health. Let me quote what Charles Rosenberg said. He said, the achievement of the Metropolitan Board of Health in the summer of 1866 has a historical significance transcending its undeniable importance in the development of public medicine. It was a successful response to a specific challenge of this new urban society. The creation of the Metropolitan Board of Health was a recognition of the fact that New York City could not be abandoned, that an urban society must somehow solve the problems that an urban society creates. Those, the culture that created New York slums, also produced the disinfectants and the scientific insights to fight cholera. Well, what they did in 1866 is they got a law through the state. They didn't know. They didn't know about germs. They didn't know what was causing it. But they did notice that the poor were getting it. And a few people began to advocate for a new system. There was already a Metropolitan Board of Health, but it was dominated by political cronies. Now they decided to put people who really were interested in medicine, especially physicians. And they said, what are we going to do? How did they know that a cholera epidemic was coming? Because it came by ship. And the knowledge was that somewhere in India or somewhere in some other world port, there was an outbreak of cholera. Then in world ports, like a New Orleans, like a Philadelphia, especially like New York, it's coming because people on the ships are going to be infected. And however it's transmitted, they could tell it's coming. So they would know as early as February 1866, the cholera is coming with the warm weather. So they got ready for it. So they got a law passed in Albany that said, we're going to have this Metropolitan Board of Health. It's going to include the greater city, not just Manhattan, but the Bronx, what later becomes the Bronx, and Queens, and Brooklyn, Staten Island. It's going to encompass the whole metropolitan area because the germs, they didn't know about germs, but they don't know where they live. You know, we got to have a little bit bigger boundaries than this. But this is what the Metropolitan Board of Health does. It asserts the power of the local government and says they had maps. And when a person got cholera, where is that person? Maybe it's down on Monroe Street, 10 Monroe Street, let's say. Obviously, there were probably houses down there before Knickerbocker Village and the Rosenbergs moved there. They would plot that on a map because generally they would tend to be in clusters. And then what they would do is they would show up with wagons and a team of people. And they would knock on the door and look for the widow or the widower or whoever it was and said, we're coming in. Not at your invitation, we're coming in. And what we want to know is, where are this individual's clothes? Where was the bedding he or she slept on? Because we're taking it out here to the vacant lot and we're going to burn it. And we're going to put lime all over everything. And we're closing this house. We'll get quarters for you somewhere else, but as far as we're concerned, something about this house we don't like. And they also cleared up all this horse manure off the streets. They said, we don't know, but we need to have a cleaner city. It seems that the dirtiest places is where so they began to systematically clean up the city. Again, doing the right things, but not because they knew what they were doing. And then when the summer of 1866 happened, it turns out that the epidemic hits other cities, but not New York. And so that gives the Metropolitan Board of Health this push that it needs. So throughout the Gilded Age, it assumes more. So, tuberculosis was killed. It's coming back because, you think you've solved a problem and then you stop doing anything and then a few germs get around. So TB is actually, I think, been coming back on the rise, but we had completely killed it off, just more or less. And there are lots of other things. They tend to come back. But public health is a new idea. From disease being something that's up to the individual, at least in cities, what they're saying is these are dangerous places. Even today in 2008, we have a fairly vague idea of why people die. Where do you get cancer? We can say, well, it seems like, I don't know, these two counties in New Jersey have a higher than average death rates from cancer, or Nebraska's low, or something else. The things they knew in the 19th century were the life expectancies in cities were less than they were in rural areas. They were pretty sure of that. So that cities would have died out, except people are constantly coming to them from the rural areas. They didn't really know. But even in our time, it's not clear because you've got to hold everything constant, and you can't hold everything constant. Age and class and everything else. But cities got safer, if not safer, than rural areas. We don't know about that particular one. But certainly the level of medical care would be higher in cities. So to some extent you could see that. But again, the Marxist interpretation would be, if they solved it, it wasn't because they cared about you. Let me just talk about one last thing, and then we'll move on kind of to sum up. But let's talk about open space. And why is open space important? Well, you are familiar with some crowded neighborhoods. 5 Points would be one example. The neighborhood made famous by Jacob Riis and How the Other Half Lives. The Lower East Side, the most crowded neighborhood in the world at the turn of the 20th century, and yet no buildings in either place taller than 5 or 6 stories. That suggested degree of overcrowding, and again, no air conditioning, often no running water, no nothing. So why is open space important, and why is the urban response to it? Well, first let me link it to cemeteries. That's an odd thing, but cemeteries are actually the first public open spaces. Now, cemeteries used to be not nice. The really first elegant cemetery in the world was Père Lachaise in Paris. It opens in 1804. And I don't know if you've been there, but it's where half the famous people in France are buried, as well as some people who are not from France. It was originally built as a rural cemetery. Now it looks like a city of itself, you know, with all these tall mausoleums all over the place. But mostly people they were buried around churches or in churches. The whole practice of being buried in a church, I think, goes from St. Constantine in Constantinople, who was buried in the main cathedral in Constantinople. And then, you know, the popes are buried, you know, in the cathedral. In the kings and queens of England are buried in Westminster Abbey. The archbishops and cardinals in New York are buried in a place that we just missed. A little bit farther north on Mulberry Street, a place called Old St. Patrick's Cathedral. There are catacombs under New York's. But, you know, obviously everybody can't be can't be buried inside of a church. There's not space. So the next best thing is to be buried near church, on holy ground. So all of you are familiar with towns all over the United States when you see a little church and there's a cemetery adjacent to it. But those generally die out as well. And now we have different kinds of churches, of cemeteries. There's usually the small town cemetery. You know, you're riding on the back roads of the United States and you're coming to a town, and out on a hill somewhere nearby, there's a cemetery. And that's where everybody's buried. But what we want to think about is a new kind of a cemetery in the world. Père Lachaise might be one, but it quickly disappears. It's what we call the rural garden cemetery. But we don't mean that it's in rural areas. It tends to be in cities. And the earliest one is called Spring Garden in Mount Auburn, not Spring Garden, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, just outside Boston. Starts in 1831. That is an elegant cemetery. Rolling little hills, winding pathways, beautiful vegetation, impressive little monuments. You could see why people in cities would go to Mount Auburn, because it was gorgeous. Or think about people living in Lower Manhattan. Well, where they would go would be to Greenwood in Brooklyn, a beautiful open space. Again, undulating ground, curving pathways, beautiful vegetation, a rural cemetery. They built these for people to die, and they thought there were really 3 reasons you might go to one. One is to commune or see the person you loved who's there. Secondly, a chance to commune with nature, because nature's supposed to jump out at you. And thirdly, to commune with God, because you can hardly go to a cemetery and not confront the fact that you too will one day be in similar circumstances. I think that's one reason we avoid cemeteries in our time, because we can live in the Pepsi generation all we want, but you go to a cemetery and suddenly you kind of begin to think, where once, the fact you'll sometimes see markers addressed to you, where you are now, so once was I, where I am now, so you will be. We don't really want to hear that message, so we don't want to know about it. But anyway, the point is that the rural garden cemeteries in places like Boston and New York, Laurel Hill in Philadelphia, the one in Chicago is called, I can't remember, Graceland is what it's called. Defense, there's usually in every city at least one of these super elite cemeteries. New York has 2, Woodlawn in the Bronx is another. The reason they're important in open space is they begin to point out that where are people going to go to have a picnic? Where do people go to breathe clean air? And so the idea of the park movement starts. Now it actually starts, you can trace it to the 1840s. Now where's there open space in other world cities before the 1840s? Of course. Where have you been? Have you been to Paris? There's open space in Paris, but the open space was royal land. That's what's around the Louvre. Or you go to England and you're landing in London, and it looks like everything is grass, but those are mostly royal parks, where the royals rode to the hounds. Later on, they become open to the people of London. But so what's important about open space in the Gilded Age or in New York, which is our function? And that is that Central Park. Now let's talk about Central Park just for a little while. Central Park, the idea comes from several people. William Cullen Bryant would be one, poet, editor of the New York Post. A few others, Andrew Jackson Downing, a landscape architect. But in the 1840s and 1850s, they begin to say that if we don't leave out some public space, all of the city will be like the city you've seen, except worse, because the city you've seen has got parks in it, or wider streets. It wasn't where people lived. So let's think about these streets. These parks. The idea was, they said, was let's create a Central Park in New York. Now, why is Central Park worth your spending any time on? It's not the oldest park in the world. Plenty of places older than that. It's not the most beautiful park in the world. I mean, it's beautiful, and I hope you have a chance to go there. But, you know, Yosemite has a pretty good claim on this one. And there are beautiful parks all over the United States and other countries that probably could put up against Central Park. And neither is it the largest. It's big. It's 843 acres, which, considering it's on a tiny island, is enormous. But it's not even the biggest park in New York City, let alone in. It is the most important public open space in the world. Now, how do I back that statement up? Because before Central Park was built, no great city in the world had ever set aside such a big space for the use of the public for free. Now there's Tiananmen Square in Beijing, but Tiananmen Square is concrete. There are lots of little markets in the middle of German cities, but they're marketplaces. There's the Common in Boston, which is little. There are the squares in Philadelphia, which are little. There is Charleston and Savannah. But what makes Central Park important is the first time the city laid it out. And what was so important about that was they noticed after they laid it out that the rise in real estate values along the edges of the park, Fifth Avenue, Central Park South, Central Park West, and even now, even Central Park North or 110th Street, were so enormous that the city argued that the park pays for itself. It's such a desirable public amenity that it works. And after Central Park was built, no other city, not Kansas City, not Omaha, not Los Angeles, not any place, could say, we can't afford a public park in our town. Because if New York City, the biggest city, where land was obviously more expensive than it was in Memphis or Kansas City, if it could lay out all this space and say, we actually didn't spend money, we created an enormous public improvement that people enjoy, and it pays for itself. So around the country in the Gilded Age, every city is building parks or park systems around the thing, modeled on the influence of Central Park. So as we think again of all these different things, I think the important thing to remember, and we could add sanitation, somebody's got to start picking up the garbage. We could think of it.